So beginning with fabric construction, how are fibers transformed to yarn and then woven into a textile. So before we look at different types of weaves, I just wanted to point out that many fabrics are made by processes other than weaving, and so therefore are not classified as woven. So just try to think about some fabrics that you might see around or might have used as an interior designer that aren't woven. So something that wasn't created on the loom. And the first thing you should maybe think about is we talked about felt. So we talked about felt when we were introduced to wool. And so wool naturally has those scales, the fibers have those scales to them so that they're easily wetted, pressed, and matted together. So without being spun into a yarn and woven into a textile, they actually create some type of fabric. So felt is an example of something that isn't created on the loom. So historically, quality felts were made from wool. And now, as you know, felts can also be made of a synthetic fiber such as a polyester. So that's what you find for 25 cents at your craft stores. What else maybe isn't woven? Well, what about things like foam or carpet padding? So carpet padding or batting, all of that again is just things that are meshed together and pressed together to form something that resembles a woven textile, right? It's not woven, but it is a fabric, but it's not woven. So things like carpet padding, batting, and foam. So as an interior designer, you will use all of these, and I'll just kind of point out quickly. Carpet padding is placed under traditional broad loom carpeting for that extra cushion. Also, as you were maybe reading some of the Pottery Barn area rug examples, they might even recommend a padding underneath an area rug, so that protects the longevity of the carpet, and it also gives that little bit of padding. You're also probably familiar with the big trend in foam mattresses. I have one. I'm actually quite happy with that. The foam mattresses, I don't know if either of you have had that comes in a box. It's mailed to you. It's not as heavy. And you pop it open and let it kind of release itself, and all of a sudden you have this mat that was mattress that was mailed to you. So I've had really good experience with that, as my kids have also had mattresses in their dorm where they actually put a new foam mattress on top of that, and they've been really happy with those now as well. Batting. When will you use batting as an interior designer? So anytime you want to place some type of material between two fabrics that are then quilted, that's when you would be using batting. So when we get to quilting, we'll talk a little bit about batting, but that's what goes between those two layers of fabrics that are then tufted, quilted, channeled, etc. Just kind of like the outside of this mattress. Gives that bit of padding. So that's where you would use those as interior designers. But then we also wanted to talk about extruded fabrics, and we have a lesson on this a little later. But anything that's film, vinyl wall coverings, vinyl fabrics, polyester fabrics, they're not woven, but rather extruded into a film. So things like, here's some vinyl wall covering. So any type of coloring, any type of print can be pressed into it, but rather than a fiber, it's extruded as what's called a film. And we'll look at more of those. But those are just examples of things that are not woven before we get to actually weaving. So long before there were vinyls and synthetic fibers, weaving was the process by which most all historic or period textiles were made. The process of weaving has changed little over time, only that it has been automated, right? And then the use of that computer to really modify those. So it has really changed little over time, but moving from hand to more automated. So the basic terms that I would like you to learn, and you've heard me use this, quickly in previous lectures, is the term warp and weft. So picturing a loom in the last slide, the warp yarns run vertical, and then the weft yarns will run parallel, perpendicular to that, perpendicular. That actually is a test question. So the weft yarns run perpendicular to the warp yarns. So here is just an example of a detail of that. So if this is running up the line of the loom, we have your warp yarns. So they run down the length of the loom. And then you have what's called the weft yarns, also called fill yarns. That's what goes left and right horizontally over and under the warp yarns. So to define, warp, parallel vertical threads laid flat and run lengthwise through the loom. So that's where you start. One would start with the warp yarns on a loom. Then weft yarns, a horizontal set or fill interlaced one thread at a time through the warp yarn. So that very simple over and under that occurs with the weft yarns. So instead of having like a big ball of yarn as you go over and under the warp yarns, there's something called a shuttle. And a shuttle looks, when you look at the automated video that's posted on that first page, when you look at the video of weaving, that little shuttle looks like a quick little rabbit that runs through the warp yarns over and under. And so the shuttle actually houses all the yarns. The fills pass through using a shuttle. So it goes over and under as if you just had like a ball of yarn in your hand, but this is nice and tidy in this little shuttle, just like the word sounds. You do need to know what the selvage is, or the selvage edge is. Selvages are the vertical edges of the woven fabric. So here you see that selvage edge. Your textbook, and you have an assignment about thread count. It's more about weight in your textbook, but we'll talk about thread count a little bit. So thread count, according to your textbook, and I support the text, it really kind of determines the quality of the fabric. So thread count means how many threads per square inch of fabric. Here is an example in this image of a high thread count. So think about that. How close and how tight all those threads are put together in a square inch. And so it becomes, very tight and strong and smooth. So that's it. It really has to do with its integrity, but also, how it feels against the skin. So a question might be, and a question that I often receive by students is, what is a good thread count? Is it 100 square threads per inch? Is it 500? Is it 250 squares per inch? So I have talked to a fabric rep about it. And, 100 to 250 threads per inch is a great thread count. What happens, this is according to a representative, if thread counts get too high, like 1,000, threads per inch, what happens is that thread is getting so thin that sometimes those threads break and fall apart. So I'll just share, if anyone here wants to share their experience. I've purchased high thread count sheets, actually from Pottery Barn, and I should be just a salesperson for them in this class. But it's just because we were looking at a lot of natural fabrics. We'll look more at contract fabrics later. And oh my goodness, did they feel good, those high thread count sheets from polyester. Did they last long? The answer was no. They didn't last that long, and they wore out and they broke by my feet and legs. So I have kind of that syndrome at night where you get that cramping and you move your legs a lot at night. So it really damaged the materials. So it's just something for you to know for your client. It felt exceptional to sleep on. I'm probably back to Kohl's sheets right now, but they didn't last as long. But definitely you want cotton, and definitely think about that high thread count. So when we're looking at thread count also, so it's not just about kind of how does it feel, the performance, but the effect that you want. So looking at this image, this has a low thread count. So it's called something that's an open weave or a casement weave. It's meant to have that certain amount of transparency, right? It's not meant to be opaque. And so to get that texture and that very kind of open feeling, there's a natural low thread count, and it's desired, right? It's desired in some settings for a interior designer. So we'll begin to look at some basic weaves, and this is where you'll really want to follow along in the excellent examples that your textbook has provided for you. And again, for those of you listening, we usually provide these samples for you in our classroom, but the textbook is our quarantine COVID solution. And I really do think they do provide some great examples, and we'll take a look at those. So we're going to start with a balanced or plain weave. So here you see you have the warp yarns running parallel, the length of the loom, and then perpendicular to that you have your weft or fill yarns moving in and out. One of your activities is actually to use a grid and to mimic these different weaves to get an effect of how these weaves work. So that is one of your activities for this week. And you're just going to do that with a grid and a pencil, so that should be pretty straightforward, but just to kind of get a feel of that. And when we say something is balanced or equal, that means that it's 1/1, right? 1/1, that very basic balanced weave. So when I was in Girl Scouts and we made our little pot holders or something like that, that was a basic weave, over, under, right, in that equal way. So examples that we'll look at are muslin, percale sheeting, burlap, canvas, gauze, chiffon, and we'll take a look at some of these. Batiste, silk, some of the silk that we'll look at like China silk, just basic over, under. And it's just going to be different about the textures of the yarns, maybe the fibers that's used that give it a different quality. So all of these that we look at next are examples of balanced or plain weaves. So first look at swatch 36. Swatch 36 is an example of a cotton voile. And a voile is a certain type of plain weave. So if you look at kind of the edges, you can see all these very fine warp yarns and fine weft yarns. It's made of cotton, so from last week's exercises, hopefully you can determine that that was then spun, because cotton needs to be spun, and it's very fine. So let's look at what the term is. What's the characteristics of this? A voile is French for veil. And there are 3 different voiles presented here for comparison. Notice the difference between the voile made of filament yarns, that's the number 37, and the voile made from spun yarns. The voile is made of hand-twisted spun cotton yarns, which maximizes its transparency. So it's very thin. So this is something that historically would have been used for a veil. And today, these lovely cotton voiles could be used perhaps for window shears, right? Shears where we want to see that light coming through. It's very lovely and it's very delicate. So touching, I would like you to feel the hand of a cotton voile. Now feel the hand of the polyester or filament voile. So sample 37 is what most shears are made of, right? So they're made of that filament yarn. Now you know what that term means. You know that is a synthetic yarn that starts in a dope stage. It's then extruded through the spinneret, and it makes that very long, fine yarn. And so when it's woven, it's very perfect and very sheer. So if you go to JCPenney's and you have some shears made, for your home, it's typically this type of voile, right? So there's no texture to it. It's very straightforward. So just feel the hand. You can feel the synthetic quality over the cotton. So it does, not that we're going to be touching our shears very much, but it does have that kind of plasticky, also kind of sheen to it. So very durable. You don't have to, it minimizes seams. I mean, you could actually run this along a whole side of your house and not have any seams. So good things about using that as well. Swatch 38 is also a shear, but it's called a crushed voile. So it's called a crushed voile because it has those pressed in crushed markings. So last week we learned that the fiber content is a synthetic fiber like polyester in swatch 38, that crushed design can actually be added to the fabric. So moving away maybe from a little bit of that boring sample of 37, adding a little crushed element maybe gives it a little more interest. So still used for window shears, but maybe when you want a little texture in that shear. Swatch 39 is a type of gauze. It's very much kind of pull on it and it stretches. So gauze is another shear made of plain weave cotton with an extremely low thread count. The thread count causes the fabric to shrink and wrinkle. Remember, it's made of cotton, right? It's a spun yarn. Very beautiful, very natural, but then there's that, it stretches and it moves and it shrinks and it wrinkles. And so sometimes that'll give it the appearance of a disorderly appearance, and that might not be desirable for some clients or for some applications. So this is a close relative to what designers use more than gauze, and that is scrim. So I use scrim a lot as which feels very much like this. I use scrim a lot in the special events industry. So when you want to do like a Southwest or something very rustic, you want to have that tablecloth that look very old and textured, almost like a burlap. We use scrim quite a bit. Plain weave, affordable, swag it, do whatever you want with it. Very affordable, basic plain weave. So in this image, you're looking at just basic rolled gauze used in the healthcare industry. But really why I wanted you to take a look at this picture, it's not a great picture. You'll never use it as an interior designer. But you can see clearly the warp yarns that are running across. And you can see how the weft yarns go over, under, over, under. When it hits the end, it returns and it comes back, over, under, over, under, over, under, returns and comes back. And so these edges haven't been cut. So this is just a quick, easy, plain weave gauze. Another example of a plain weave is swatch number 40 called organdy. Organdy is a lightweight, plain weave cotton fabric made with a stiffening finish. That's the key point there. The finish makes it the sheerest of the cotton fabrics. It also has body not present in the previous shears that we looked at. So go ahead and manipulate the textile. So I ask you to just put some pleats in shear number 40, swatch number 40. So this is also used for shears. And you can see that it has that stiffness, gives it a lot more body. So I'm going to give you an example maybe where I would use this as an interior designer. So throughout my history of designing model homes, I designed a lot of really cute bedding for nurseries or little girls' rooms. And if I wanted to put a sheer, let's say, ruffled trim around a pillow, or a sheer ruffled trim, very structured as a sheer crib bed or a crib or bed skirt, I would use this if I wanted it to look very stiff and very kind of collar of a dress or collar of a skirt. So that's where I would use it, where I really, if I didn't want it to have a beautiful drape, but I wanted to have that stiffness. So sometimes if you are, now go back to number 38, which is right next to us. And if I ruffled that and I was trying to make that a sheer ruffle around the pillow, it wouldn't have enough body. And I'm going to use the word, it looks very limp. And sometimes we use this kind of silly little term as a designers. It looks sad. It doesn't look tight and prim. It looks a little sad because it doesn't have that body. So that's where I would use organdy. And then next to that is organza. Organza is this filament, meaning it's used a synthetic fiber, polyester. In this example, it's nylon. So it's the counterpart to organza. So it's sheer, it's a little more luxurious. It has that luster, and again, it has a little more body. So not as beautiful for draping, again, but it has that body, so you can ruffle it and pleat it and do some more fun things with it. Any questions about the use of organdy or organza? Chiffon is another basic weave. It was traditionally woven from silk, but today most chiffon is from polyester. And these, like others that we've looked at, has that very high, fine, twisted yarn. So it's sheer, soft, light, and so it looks very fragile, very fragile. Great for draping. So take a look at another plain weave, swatch 42. It's in green and a tan color, but typically, maybe traditionally, we've seen gingham prints, like if you saw The Wizard of Oz, maybe it's blue and white. If you've seen a tablecloth, country tablecloth, maybe it's red and white. So it doesn't matter the color, but the plain weave, by using different color yarns, creates this checkerboard effect. So let's read about the swatch. So this is cotton. We know from last week that that means that the yarn is typically spun. This is an example of a plain weave balanced, so over and under of different colors. The yarns are actually dyed, and that makes sense. If you're using two different colors and weaving it together to create this kind of checker effect, you would need to have those yarns dyed. And these are used, I've used these in light upholstery, I've used these for bedding, pillows, accessories, I've used them for window valances. So if you feel it, it's not good to drape. It doesn't feel that great to drape. It's a little heavy. But you certainly can use those like in a top treatment for a window covering or something like that. Great little ruffles for pillows. So yes, I've used ginghams a lot, especially when I do country-inspired interiors. Gingham is a cotton-like fabric with an even checkered pattern. The fabric is made of white or off-white and then another color. Some gingham variations are smaller than this, and some are even larger. So those really large ones are called buffalo checks, and that's like what a lumberjack would wear, like a lumberjack shirt. But it's still created from this basic plain weave, and that's what I really want you to know, how a pattern is created from a weave. Swatch number 43 is a chambray. It is made of cotton. It's spun yarn. The yarn was dyed. So chambray is either made of linen or cotton-like fabric that uses white and a color in its yarn. Chambray has all white yarns in one direction and colored yarns in the other, creating a denim-like appearance. So in a few pages, we're going to get to what denim is, what type of weave a denim is. But when you look at swatch number 43, this is a plain weave again, over and under. But one direction, if you pull the yarns out, it looks like in the weft direction, it's white, and in the warp direction, it's blue. And so by weaving that over and under, you get that kind of denim color or denim effect. Swatch number 44 is also a plain weave, over and under. So like the previous example in the chambray, the shantung has filament yarns in the warp direction and slub yarns in the weft. This creates a subtle surface texture. So up and down in the weft direction, you have those very fine filament yarns. So you can see that's why it looks silky, silk-like. But then going across in the weft direction, some of those yarns have that slub. So going from fat to skinny to fat to skinny, and now it creates a little bit of texture. So here you're seeing something made in polyester that resembles silk, right? It resembles what sometimes occurs naturally in silk, where you might have different little slubs and nubs. But here it's being created using polyester. So it gives a little bit of texture, a little more interest to the surface. Swatch 45 next to it. The fiber context is flax, meaning what? Linen. The yarn is spun, which linen is. And it's a plain weave, which means it does just simply go over and under. But what makes this different? So this doesn't feel very beautiful. I don't want to be sleeping on this, right? I don't want to be sleeping on this. I don't want to, maybe put my face against this. But let's just see what a butcher linen or a crash linen is. It's considered the heaviest of the linens, and it's getting its name from traditional butcher shop aprons. So this is what butchers would have worn as aprons. And they were designed to be what? Sturdy. So feel that. It doesn't have that beautiful drape or hand. It was designed to be sturdy. The linen has slubs in both directions and must be made of a bast fiber to be called linen. So bast coming from that stem. So just looking at the yarns, they have more slubs to it, they're thicker, and so we have this really heavy, durable weave. So as an interior designer, you can use that for upholstery, for pillows, for accessories, but probably not, you can tell, draperies, no. Here's just some different examples of basic plain weaves. So plain weaves is the most straightforward and affordable of the weaves. So typically muslin and burlap are these simple, plain, and affordable weaves. So on the left, where do you use muslin as an interior designer? Well, when you upholster something, first you put the batting or the cushion, and then you cover that first with muslin before you put your final upholstery on top of that. So that's where we see a lot of muslin. And burlap, when would you use burlap as an interior designer? Very rarely, probably just for some decorative treatments, such as like a burlap pillow if you're doing a cowboy theme or something like that. So very rarely do we use burlap. Canvas, so most of our canvas, like awnings, duck, or sailcloth, is just a simple plain weave because it's strong, firm, and affordable. And most cotton prints are on just basic plain weave, plain woven textiles. So most prints are a plain weave.